This is part 2 of Ancient Civilizations from Mr. O'Keefe's World History class. And before we get into anything new, I do like to review what we learned about in the last part. So a couple review questions for you. How did ancient people use innovations to help them adapt to their environment? The answer, some examples, dikes, dams, irrigation, and aqueducts help to control the flow of water. Also, from your assignment, you probably learned about the wheel and the sail, how they were used for transportation. The plow and the bronze deposits tools there were used for agriculture. Those are just some examples. What was the Neolithic Revolution? Remember, revolution is a major change, so this was a major change from a nomadic lifestyle to a civilized one caused by the innovation of farming. Farming happened, people did not have to be nomadic anymore. So what was the most important thing to ancient people? Having a surplus of... The answer there is food and water. And surplus is when you have a lot of it. So having a lot of food and water is really important. We don't really think about it today, but back then it was the difference between life and death. Where is the Huanghe River Valley? The answer there is China. On which river did the Egyptian civilization thrive? That is the Nile River. Where was the Indus River? Answer there is India. What was the area around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers called? There are two names for this. The Fertile Crescent is one of these names, and Mesopotamia is another. Okay, so today we are going to talk about government, different forms of government. And maybe the form of government you're most used to is your parents. You probably don't think of them as government, probably think of them as more of a pain in the butt sometimes, but they are kind of like a government, because a government is created to kind of organize and protect you. And your parents definitely do that. They make sure that you're provided for. Not that governments are supposed to do that all the time, but that's what your parents do, hopefully. And they do kind of organize your life at times. Maybe you're not too happy about that, but that's what they do. And our government definitely organizes us. Right now you're watching this because you are in school, and that is set up by the government. If you're in school right now, you drove on roads. That's organized by the government. If something bad happens, the police come, organized by the government. The school catches on fire, hopefully not. Maybe you'd be okay with that, but not me. The fire department would come. That's organized by the government. So organization, protection is why the government exists. In ancient times, part of that organization was to oversee public works projects. And by public works, we mean kind of like today, roads, maybe public buildings. Like back then, you'd have temples. Today, public buildings would be like libraries and schools, police stations, any government buildings like the White House, the Capitol building. Those are all government buildings. Also to create laws. And laws are basically just created to protect people. And we'll get into laws more specifically later on. So one of the river valleys we'll talk about today is Egypt. Now, Egypt was ruled by a king. You know them as Pharaoh. And this is an example of a monarchy. When you have a king and they rule everything by themselves, that is a monarchy. We look at that prefix, M-O-N, and that means one. Like Monday is the first day of the week. Excuse me. So that is an example of one ruler. That's the king. Now, what if you have a dictator? Would that be a monarchy? No, because a monarchy, well, first of all, they don't call them a king, because king and queen are is passed down through heredity, where a dictator doesn't usually do that. So it's one ruling family. To give you an example, if you look at this picture to the left, we know King Tut. King Tut is one of the most famous pharaohs, even though he didn't really do much when he was alive. He's more famous for his burial and the discovery of all the treasures in his tomb. So King Tut died when he was pretty young, and when they found his body, they realized this guy was a mess alive. He had all kinds of physical problems. And the reason that he had physical problems, well, probably was the way that that families would reproduce, especially in royal circles, was that they believed, one family was stronger or better. The ruling family, the family related to the monarch, the pharaoh, was better than everyone else. In fact, pharaohs were believed to be kings, or I'm sorry, they were kings. They were believed to be gods. So how could a god, have a child with someone who's not God? And then you have a half god, and eventually that gets broken down. So what you'd see a lot is incest. You'd see um, relations with cousins or sisters sometimes, or pretty gross, pretty nasty. So a way to remember this other term that we'll talk about later is dynasty. A dynasty is a ruling family. So if you think of the last part, nasty, when we're talking about what we're talking about here, dynasty is a term that means that the rule is passed down throughout the family, and sometimes it was, done by the family. Pretty gross, but that's how they did things back then. Moving to China, less gross. China had a bureaucracy. Actually went from gross and interesting to just boring. But a bureaucracy is important, even though it's boring. If you look at this word and break it down, you have CRACY, which you see the suffix for a lot of different government related words is, and then the bureau. So what's a bureau? Well, like old people, really old people, we'll call a dresser a bureau. What's a dresser? Well, you have a drawer for your socks, a drawer for your underwear, a drawer for your shirts, a drawer for your pants. I don't know how else you have it broken up, but you get the idea. So you have basically these different departments for different things, and that's what a bureaucracy is. And like that, think about our school. Our school is a bureaucracy where we have different levels of authority. Right? We have the principal. He oversees the school. We have the vice principals. We have the teachers. And then there's you guys. But the whole point of it is for you, right? And I can't teach everything. What if you came to school and they're like, all right, Mr. O'Keefe is just going to be your teacher for everything. He's going to teach you everything. I can't teach you math because you don't want to learn math from me. You probably are better at math than I am. But my specialization is social studies. I can teach you about that. So we have specialized teachers, right? And that's kind of the same thing for your bureaucracy. If you look at our government, for example, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, there's that word here. So their specialty is, of course, looking into crime. Just an example, but that's how governments are broken up today, and it's kind of all traced back to these ancient times. Now, some governments would be more aggressive, and they would create an empire. The first empire in the world is the Akkadians. Way to remember that is Akkadian starts with the letter A. A is the first letter. They're the first empire. And if you look at this map, so Acadia is, they put a question mark because they don't know. It was a long time ago. But we do know that they would take over all these other city-states with their military, or maybe just by their reputation sometimes. People wouldn't want to fight. They would surrender, and now one king rules over many different cities. That is an empire. When you take over by force one large, or maybe not large, but a place where there's other nations or territories under your control. Technically, the U.S. is an empire. Maybe not the continental U.S., maybe not even Alaska, but Hawaii for sure is part of the U.S. because we went to Hawaii and we basically told them that they need to follow our rules and be part of our country, and the government there didn't really want to, but they did anyways because we pretty much made them. So that technically makes us an empire. Another form of government is theocracy, very common in ancient times. So theocracy, and just like bureaucracy, we have this suffix, the cracy, that if you see that, you know it's about government or organization. This prefix theo, like theology, is a study of religion. So theocracy is a government ruled by a religion. So in the case of Babylon and most other theocracies, you have a priest that rules, and they say basically, "Hey, I'm the voice of God, or I'm the voice of the gods, or whatever, however their religion is, and you have to do what I say." And there are some countries in the world that are like that today, not very many, but they do exist. And it was pretty easy to be in control of that. How could they question you if you speak for God? And people use that as a tool. People still use that today as a tool to get power when they pretty much tell you what they think God believes. And if you believe them, then, and if you believe in that God, then you kind of have to follow them, right? So it can be used for good or used for bad, but back then it was certainly a way that people were able to rule over a country effectively. And we'll talk about Hammurabi later on another day. Moving forward in time to Greece. So we saw a map of Greece last time, and we talked about how it was geographically divided by islands and mountains and rivers and things like that, where they all had similar religion, they had a similar language, but they did have different cultures for each of their city-states. And those cultures will kind of lead to the government, because a lot of times governments do represent the culture of a people. If there's a very religious culture, like in Iran, they would have a theocracy. It kind of makes sense. In the U.S., though, we're more liberal society. Like we like freedom. We don't necessarily like governments to be in our business, so we have a democracy. So the same thing is true in Greece. Most of Greek history, we see aristocracies. Okay, again, you have your CRACY ending here. Let's use red. Remember that relates to government. What about this part? So, an aristocrat is someone who's rich. Maybe you've heard that word before. Someone who's really high up, upper class. Donald Trump is an aristocrat. Maybe that's not a good example because he's the president. Oprah Winfrey is an aristocrat. Bill Gates is an aristocrat. Rich, famous people. So when these people rule, you have your upper class people rule. That's an aristocracy. Okay, way to remember it is it starts with the letter A. If you are an A student, then that's the best grade you can get. So that's rule of the best. So that's what the nobility means. It means the upper class. And this again is done by your family. And so if you were in the aristocracy, it's because your father was and his father before them. And that's also, by the way, how you have so much money. If you're in the aristocracy, you probably didn't work a job like people do today. You're just born with money and land, and people worked for you, and you just got to kind of hang out. So a pretty good deal. And there's certainly advantages and disadvantages to an aristocracy. And of course, with most of history, there's a cycle, right? So you have aristocracies that rule for a while, and then people get sick of them. They don't do a good job ruling. People get ideas from outside areas where we could do better than the aristocracy. We could try something different. So people called tyrants get power usually from the military, their usual military leaders, and they had soldiers loyal to them, and they were able to overthrow an aristocracy. And when you take over by force, you kind of get the idea that force can help you out. So they also usually rule by force. Now, in Greek history, this is important because tyrannies usually don't last very long. And this is where the word dictator kind of comes from, where if you take over by force, you're usually known as a dictator. And there's not, once you die, then there's this big struggle for power and it goes to some other form of government. And that's exactly what happened in Greece. Dictators took over, took out the aristocracy. They rule for a while by force. they don't really have anyone promised to rule next. And then what happens? Well, it depends on where in Greece you're talking about. But remember, tyranny is ruled by force. Now in Athens, once their tyrant was gone, they adopted a democracy. Here we have the suffix "cracy" again. And then we have the prefix demo. Demos is a Greek word for people. So democracy is ruled by the people. We've heard this before. Hopefully you know this. Now Athens had a direct democracy where they would vote they would vote for basically on policies. Yes or no, we should have this law. Yes or no, we should have that law. Now we in the U.S. have a representative democracy where we don't vote on laws usually. We vote for people, and they're supposed to kind of carry out what they say they'll do. So for example, if you wanted to have a law to outlaw cats, I don't really like cats, so I would probably be in favor of that law. In a direct democracy, you would just go to the voting booth and you would say, or in Athens, they have different color rocks for families, and you put it in a pile, yes or no. I would put my rock in the yes pile, and then they'd count the rocks, and that would win. A representative democracy, they'll have to find someone who promised to outlaw cats, and I would vote for that person, then hopefully they would do that. So that's the difference between direct and representative democracy. You vote directly or you vote for a representative. Here you see a picture of the Parthenon in Athens, and that's who we just talked about. Athens had the first democracy that we know of. And the Lincoln Memorial, that's obviously in Washington, D.C., and you can see that there's a lot of similarities here. And that's kind of a nod by the U.S. to Athens for, hey, thanks for having a democracy. We brought it back way later on. But of course, there's some respect towards the Athenian culture and government. Another form of government is an oligarchy. And this is similar to an aristocracy because it's ruled by the rich. Now, instead of an aristocracy where you could have a couple hundred people ruling, the oligarchy is a handful of people. And it's not voting, you just have a couple very rich people who are able to control the government. And this isn't the same suffix that we've been seeing, but just like monarchy, it's similar, right? So the CRACY and the ARCHY suffixes, you see those, and hopefully you'll know that has something to do with government. So this is ruled by the few. Maybe you can insert rule by the powerful few, but it's not ruled by one person. It's not ruled by hundreds of people. It's ruled by a handful of people. All right, so let's just review these one more time. Aristocracies rule the best. The upper class rules. Tyranny ruled by force. They usually use violence to take power, and they use violence to keep their power. Democracy ruled by the many. We know what that is. Oligarchy, you have a couple people that are rich and powerful that rule. And I could also add in theocracy. Remember that. That's the rule by religion, ruled by a priest, and monarchy ruled by a king or queen. So we're going to move from Greece to Rome. Rome has a lot of similar history to the U.S., at least early history. They were ruled over by a king, initially by the Etruscan king, and they overthrew that king and formed their own country. So that sounds pretty familiar to the U.S. And then they didn't form a monarchy, but they formed a republic, which is also what the U.S. did. Even though monarchies were kind of the thing to do, they did something different. They had a republic. So a republic, it's a representative of the public. Should make sense, right? That's what we have. We have people who represent us. We don't. It's a representative democracy. It's the same thing. A republic is a representative democracy. At least it can be. Now, if you don't pick the representative, then it's not a representative democracy. Some places they didn't. These people were appointed by maybe the dictator or someone higher up. They weren't elected. So all republics aren't democracies. But as far as the Roman Republic, it was a democracy. So again, republic, controlled by officials elected by citizens. And like we talked about before with the aristocracies, as history goes on, things change. New ideas come about from trade and learning different perspectives, and people want to change. And one of the reasons they wanted to change is because there is this large gap between the rich and the poor. There wasn't a middle class. Like today, most people in America live in the middle class. And that kind of leads to some people are lower, some people are higher, but it's kind of a happy medium. Not that everything's perfect, but we're probably not going to have a dictator come to power like they did in Rome. So in Rome, they had a couple people who were super rich and everyone else was super poor. And we see that throughout history. That's a good recipe for a big revolution. The same happened in Russia before World War One, or sorry, during World War One, where they had same type of thing that led to the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet Union came to power. So history doesn't necessarily repeat, but we can see themes that are similar throughout history. So there's the Civil War. Julius Caesar leads it. He ends up leading the Roman Republic, but then famously, Ides of March is stabbed to death by the Senate. And he was this really, really respected, pretty much celebrity in Rome. So when he was killed, people really wanted, that was kind of it for the Senate. They really, even though some people supported the Senate before that Julius Caesar was so widely respected in Rome that public sentiment kind of went against the Republic. So you have this new guy, Augustus Caesar. He's going to be the first Roman emperor. Is he a tyrant? Kind of. Julius Caesar was. He fought a war to take over. So we could say that. I mean, Augustus Caesar also fought a war. There's all kinds of triumvirates and wars between Roman generals, and we don't have time for all that. It's not that exciting, at least to me, so we're just going to go through that. But what you need to know is Augustus Caesar is the first Roman emperor. How do you remember that? Well, August starts with A. A is the first letter in the alphabet, so it seems like this works out a lot. Also, August is the first month of school, so, and that's kind of where August comes from. Julius Caesar, July, August is after July. So if I ask you who's first, Julius or August, refer to your calendar knowledge. And you'll know that Julius Caesar is first, and then Augustus Caesar. And then September is Caesar. Just kidding. I made that up. It's my lame joke for the day. Anyways, so he's the first Roman emperor, and he creates the Roman Empire. Now you have one person ruling. When he dies, his son doesn't take over. That's not how it happens. Someone else takes over. And so it is a tyranny, but it's a very long-lasting tyranny, which is pretty rare. All right, so to finish up, we're going to review. So what is the purpose of government? To organize and protect a society. How does a bureaucracy work? Break down the two parts of that word. Roles are specialized and have different levels of authority. We talked about the school. The military is another good example of that. Not everyone in the military shoots people with machine guns. You have people in the military who are doctors. You have people who deliver mail. You have cooks. You have janitors. So everyone in the military has a different job, different levels of authority. It's a bureaucracy. How did a country become an empire? It would use force to take over the lands of other countries and absorb those lands into its own. Expanding its borders by force makes it an empire. Give an example of a monarchy. My example, the king outlawed dabbing. It makes you look silly. Stop it. This is an example here because the king didn't ask anyone. He didn't need votes. He didn't need sponsorship. He just said it, and that was that. That's how monarchy works. Remember, M-O-N means one, and then we have this word that relates to government. Who rules in an aristocracy? The upper class, the whole entire class of people rules. And we're talking a couple hundred people usually. Where do the rules come from in a theocracy? They come from the holy writings or priests. So if you have a Christian theocracy, the laws would come from the Bible. If you have an Islamic theocracy, the laws would come from Sharia law, which is their law code derived from the Quran. What is a tyranny? Tyranny is a government that comes to power and rules by use of force. They use force to take power and to keep it. Okay, and that's the notes for today. Thank you very much.